based on three subtopics. One is going to try and look at the crisis of global capitalism and how it impacts on us in terms of pursuing development and politically. The second one is going to be the weak challenge of the left to capitalism. And then I'll conclude by analyzing the two and provide some suggestions in terms of way forward. With regards to the first issue of the crisis of global capitalism, I think the global capitalism is imploding. That's how deep this crisis is. It's a crisis that is not going away. It's a crisis that didn't just start with the financial meltdown that resulted into a great recession in 2009, but rather it goes back in the 70s when the post-war boom came to an end and a slump in the global capitalism crept in. So the response of capitalists to the 1970s slump, because what had got exhausted was the demand that has been created by the destruction of war, the investments that had been made in the war effort, the investment that had been made to take advantage of the demand that had arisen in advancing certain industries, such as automobile, housing, and so on. In the 70s, from 1945, that boom came to an end. When it came to an end, they had no runaway industry in the northern countries of the globe. So instead, they financialized, they globalized. The financial sector tended to play more of a prominent role. That's when neoliberalism was actually inaugurated. So in a way, we've been sitting with a stagnation in the economy, in that since the 70s, the crisis that had kicked in of low growth, of low levels of profits, was never resolved, but instead was managed through financialization. And it had devastating effects to the South, you know. The debt problem in the South, the modernization of poverty in the global South, and the deepening of inequality that has been building from the 70s, actually, you know, even in the North and in the South. So what we saw in 2008, 2009 was an implosion or an explosion of this long building crisis of financial capitalism, or financial capital's dominance, rather. And still, the response of capital, they are found wanting. They don't have a runaway industry, you know, whereas after crisis, they usually, like after the Great Depression of the 30s, the automobile came about and it was a runaway industry. So they could invest there and build the economy from those investments. Currently, there are no outlets for productive investment. There are no outlets. And even the talk about the fourth revolution, it's not going to solve their problems, because for as long as you have low levels of consumer spending, of aggregate demand in the economy, there's no automation that is going to solve their problem. So this industrial revolution actually is unlike earlier revolutions that were able to employ people in large numbers and thereby creating a higher aggregate demand. This doesn't do that. And so it is still not a lucrative outlet for productive investment. So it's a crisis, therefore, comrades, that is raging and it's not going away. Samir Amin says, or first, Emmanuel Wallerstein says this crisis is going to be with us for the next 20 to 40 years. Even after that, capitalism is not going to come alive out of this crisis. He says even capitalists are aware of that. So all they are trying to do is to build a successor to capitalism that will still be another social system of class hierarchy, of exploitation. So that's what they are trying to do. Samir Amir poses it differently. He says, should we save a capitalism that is in crisis, or should we save humanity from a capitalism that is prone to crisis? And he does a lot of analysis to show that this crisis is not going away. In fact, even mainstream economists, Paul Krugman, Stiglitz, the bright minds of the economics professions, they are conceding a concept of stagnation, which means a period of long-term low growth levels, has been brought back to economics. Even them, they are talking about it. Even IMF in their outlooks, they talk about this crisis staying with us for much longer. Even the South African Treasury, in its outlook, say the same thing. So I'm surprised why they call this recession that happened a technical recession, when they know anyway, it's a crisis that never went away. So we're bound one way or the other. Look at the data. Growth levels have always been low. They never went back to what they were pre-2008. So even National Treasury says it in their outlook that this crisis could be with us for much longer. They said that long before these results of last week were published. So it's a deep crisis. Samir Amin concludes by saying, actually, he retorts by invoking Rosa Luxemburg remarks that we are back to either barbarism or capitalism. Socialism. It's barbarism, which is this crisis of capitalism, or socialism. Those are the stark choices for humanity now. If not socialism, another system that will be egalitarian, that will promote social progress is needed. Barbarism is never an option. But if there's no alternative, Samir Amin is saying we're likely to be trapped into this tragic impasse for much longer. So it is against that background, really, that the South African economy is doing badly, because it is highly connected to the global economy in a dependent way of exporting raw minerals. We never built a sovereign economy after 1994. We continued the old accumulation that is dominated by these monopolies in mining, finance, and energy. Finance grew larger, actually. I mean, it became what? It's now 20% or 21% on other days of our GDP. And yet we're not exporting any financial services. Actually, these banks you see here, they are not owned here. They are foreign owned. And that's what makes the concept of white monopoly capital inadequate to explain our situation, because it assumes that white people here are owning these things. this is foreign capital in all industries. You know, the monopolies are owned from outside. Now, and the neoliberal policies that were inaugurated officially in 1996 enabled South African capitalism to restructure that way, to globalize and financialize. So it's not like they are unpatriotic, you know, as some say. No, no, no. The policies we adopted, had we adopted more audacious policies that control the movement of capital, that pushes an active industrial policy, results would have been different. Then that takes me to the next question of the weak challenge to capitalism by the left. The dramatic downfall of Soviet Union 27 years ago was the biggest event that shifted world political affairs. Not in favor of the left, you know, in favor of the imperialist forces led by America and their allies in Europe, Japan, and elsewhere. We saw that, I mean, immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union, US sought to render the United Nations ineffective. They unilaterally invaded Iraq during the first Gulf War in February. Oh, I can't remember the month now. But in 1991, they invaded, or late 1990, they invaded Iraq unilaterally. So the collapse of the Soviet Union was a blow to the international left. But I think sometimes it's exaggerated because it's posed as though the Cold War was simply between the US and the Soviet Union. You know, the world affairs were simply dominated by the US and the Soviet Union in that simplistic way, that this side it was the US with its allies, this side it was the Soviet Union with its allies. It was not like that. Remember, comrades, there was always China, which was never allied with the Soviet Union, you know, in being subordinate to it. And in the 60s, there was the Sino-Soviet split. I mean, Soviet Union advocating for peaceful coexistence with the West or capitalism. China is saying, hell no. You know, so China always did things its own ways, different from Soviet Union. And China even had a seat in the Security Council of the United Nations. And they would not call Kremlin to ask for mandates when they go there. No, they would vote on their own. So China has always been its own man. But other than China, there was another factor as well. There was banding, comrades. You know, the 1955 conference where they met, I'm about to conclude. There was banding as well, which really organized countries of the South, Asia and Africa. I mean, Egypt was leading Africa there. And later it became the non-aligned movement with Cuba playing a more leading role. But now that I have to conclude, let me rush to come back home quickly. Here, the biggest, the fall of the Soviet Union also coincided with the weakening of the left. And I conceptualized the left as not just communists, but you had communists, you had social democrats, you had national liberation movements. You know, those were the main camps. They have since gotten weakened, and they have never revived. And it seems the model that they follow, the political model that they follow, the old left, the Communist Party's national liberation, is exhausted. And then that takes me to the SACP. to say the SACP has been the biggest player in the South African left. Currently, the SACP has grown to be courageous to speak against the rot of the ANC. What should we make of the critical posture of the SACP? Is it audacity or still quagmire? I think they're trapped in a quagmire. The SACP doesn't want to make a decision that we're leaving. And this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a united front. And yes. On the other hand, they are pushing for Cyril. No, Cyril is our man, but no. We have not officially announced, but everybody in the SSCP is saying Cyril. So they want to play safe. So whichever way the outcomes, they said, no, we never push for Cyril anyway. So if they leave, we said, no. We always indicated that we might leave. So, yeah, so it's a quagmire. It's not clear what do they want to do. But it's worse now. Actually, the SSCP, of all the alliance bodies, it is the only one that can break out and forge something truly of a project, because it is a political party, it's not a faction, it's not a substructure of the ANC, but it does not want to operate that way. And I'm saying the reason the SSCP is not able to be audacious is because for most of the time in the 90s, the SSCP never had an independent program of its own, that is socialist, that it used in the alliance to bargain, to say, as the SSCP, this is how we want things to be, and fight over it. There were times when the SSCP fought, but when the balance of forces in the ANC changes, they say, no. They join. And then, no, Umsholozi are corrupt. When they said, no, we need a law to defend Umsholozi. You remember, Comrade Blake said that. We need a law. Because there's a lot of attack on Umsholozi, you know. And so it's a quagmire. I don't know how they are going to handle it. And again, we have the EFF. The EFF, I think, is part of the new left. The new kid on the block, they should be praised for having brought back radical demands of land and economic transformation. You know, however, their notions at times seem to be limited, but at least, you know, for that, and corruption as well, for being very vocal on corruption. But the EFF is limited strategically. They don't seem to be having a clear vision, you know, around which they mobilize. They like more anti than for something. They don't have to. They don't seem to be having a clear strategy that follows their own promises that they are mass protest movement. They are not involved in community struggles. The only time there's a big march is when there's juju. EFF is largely organized around the charisma of Comrade Julius Malema. And I think that's good, but it's also a weakness because the EFF can't grow beyond his charisma. And the old left, the other old left, the Trotskyites, the PACs, the Azapos, they've just become irrelevant. I mean, Azapo had a conference. It was only covered in Facebook. No media house covered it. So in conclusions, Chair.
1 minute.
Yes, 1 minute. In this minute, as I conclude, Chair, I'm saying the challenge for the left is that we need to push for a sovereign industrial production system in the country with strong manufacturing sectors that will employ more people. Sovereign in that it must de-link somehow from global capitalism. Not completely, it will always be relative. But again, sovereign because it must have an agricultural sector that produces food security and food sovereignty. And our idea of a movement towards socialism, we must abandon these old ways of thinking, you know, even about class struggle, that is a bourgeoisie and the proletariat in a constant struggle. We must think rather about how we mobilize popular classes through a program that expresses their own demands and at the same time, it relies on their energies. We should just forget about these vanguardist, entryist approach. And it's good the Communist Party is talking about a united front. And therefore, in that united front, both the type of democracy we promote should have the elements of both the representative and the participatory, strengthening more the participatory forms of democracy. And lastly, this movement towards socialism should be a movement of unity in diversity. You know, we should try very much. Remember the first international, Karl Marx didn't go there having in his pocket the Communist Manifesto. He went there to engage with other comrades. And he was elected to be the main drafter most of the time. And as he was drafting speeches of the First International, he didn't slot in unilaterally the Communist Manifesto. No. He still engaged comrades based on their own programs from all European tendencies there. And the First International was strong. But the Third International, I think, that's why they said, no, one country, one Communist Party. Maybe I should abandon that, comrades. Thank you.
Over to Alex.
Comrade Garnett, I have my notes here, and I was discussing with a comrade of mine where I was seated as to what approach must I adopt. He advised me not to read the notes but to talk. But I'm changing that decision. I'm going to read the notes. Because if I talk, you might think that I'm responding to what you just said. The notes were planned before I listened to you. And just my note for Comrade Samantha, I did discuss this with her before we started here. Comrade Samantha, in the last session, you were able to disaggregate the British Labour Party. You were able to bring to the fore certain tendencies in the British Labour Party, the conservative, the reactionary, and different strands, and you said this. The weakness of what you did is that when you came to the ANC, you just simply said, this is a bunch of neoliberals. So you didn't disaggregate it. But I don't blame you. We must do it for you because we are here in South Africa. We must say to you, there are revolutionaries in the African National Congress who are more progressive than the people or the characters you mentioned in the British Labour Party. Because under Tony Blair, British did two things. It deepened neoliberalism and it made war. And you can't be praising the British Labour Party and attacking the African National Congress and its alliance. That is a contradiction, which is why I raised the question I did raise. We will disaggregate it on another platform. The main challenge facing economic and social development, I think this is our subject now.
It is.
Okay. Challenges facing social and economic development in South Africa. That can be summarized only in one word. In one word only. Capitalism, Comrade Garnett. That's the primary contradiction of the South African society. And I wish to even say this to some of the students who are here, who have been leading the struggle in campuses, forging a movement around the notion of decolonization. So far as I understand it, historically and otherwise, in South Africa, capitalism is a colonial mode of production that unless you do away with it, you will not even decolonize. The decolonization struggle in South Africa must be a struggle to overthrow capitalism and remove it because it was imposed as a colonial mode of production from Britain. And of course, the Dutch East India Company. That is what it should mean by decolonization. I just thought I should add this. Now, the primary contradiction facing the South African society, as I said, is capitalism as well as its continuing legacy of colonialism and apartheid and its dominance in the form of imperialism. The imperialist agenda of neoliberalism, as Comrade Garnett has said, developed over the past few decades predating our April 1994 democratic breakthrough. It was streamlined and hardwired in our post-1994 policy from 1996 by the adoption in government undemocratically under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki as the executive deputy president of the state of a policy called growth, employment and redistribution, in short, GEAR. There was no consultation. It was very bad. I saw a letter in the media, Thabo Mbeki, asking us, why are we comparing his presidency and that of Jacob Zuma? There was just no consultation under Mbeki when this policy was imposed in government. In fact, I still remember him, Garnet, when he was still within our fold. If I were to quote him, at our 10th National Congress in Johannesburg, he arrived there and said the idea that some of us are going to build their movements on the savage carcasses of the African National Congress is wrong in the extreme because the death of the ANC will not come. In other words, telling us to leave the alliance, something that Mandela said a day before. So there was just no consultation, and in fact, the alliance was marginalized. There was this fight. I wish we could create another session where I debate this. The development of neoliberalism, as Garnet said, is traced by many studies, at least to the multiple crises of capitalism that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s, displacing or eroding the post-World War II relatively regulated capitalism. In his Capital Volume 3, Karl Marx writes that capitalist production seeks to continually overcome its imminent barriers, but it does so only by means which again place such barriers in its way and on a more formidable scale. In this context, neoliberalism can be characterized both as a product of the multiple capitalist system crisis from which it was developed, as an inner system alternative, in other words, an alternative within the logic of capitalism, and as the cause of the multiple crises of capitalism that were to follow, including the ongoing crises that pose a challenge to social and economic development in South Africa. The recent announcement of this investment and exit from manufacturing in South Africa by the US-based multinational corporation General Motors. I'm studying the sector in my PhD studies, and my professor is here. I was just finalizing one of the chapters we will be discussing in a week or two. This is the reason why I borrow from that sector, because I spent a lot of my time writing and researching about that sector. So this exit by General Motors is part and parcel of the results of the crisis of capitalism. And I'm looking at it from a point of view of its impact in the value chain as well. The same applies to the recession that South Africa experienced after the 2008 eruption of capitalist crisis and the one announced this week, rather than merely a set of right-wing ideas and policy regimes. Neoliberalism has developed from those ideas and policy regime to become a dominant form or the reigning variant of capitalism and imperialism, which according to Lenin is the highest stage of capitalism. Neoliberalism is no longer just a set of ideas or policy regime. It has actually restructured the labor process and given rise to a particular variant of capitalism. Let's call it neoliberal capitalism. It has also manifested itself as an imperialist agenda, giving it a neoliberal outlook on a global scale, called neoliberal globalization. We must unite to address and finally resolve the problems of class inequality, unemployment, and poverty, all together with their racial, gender, spatial, internal, and external dimensions. But unless we appreciate that class inequality, unemployment, and poverty form the conditions of existence, the products and lever of the accumulation of wealth on a capitalist basis, we are likely not to go to the root. That is, we are likely not to become radical in seeking solutions. We are going to be seeking solutions in the hot pot, within the logic of capitalism. And immediately we do that, we are going to repeat what Marx said about capitalists, who are able to overcome impediments to their system of accumulation, but only by means that place or lay the basis for the emergence of new impediments on a sustainable basis. Yes, let us address these problems, as Marx and Engels say in the Manifesto of the Communist Party, when they refer to the immediate aims of the working class and enforcement of their momentary interests. But at the same time, let's take care of the future, which is the overthrow of the system. because capitalism doesn't come from, the problems of inequality, unemployment, and poverty do not come from white people, as the narrow nationalists want us to believe. They come from the system of capitalism, which in South Africa, of course, many capitalists happen to be white. So this appreciation must distinguish what, in my view, should constitute a distinguishing factor between the left and the right. All right. One of the challenges the left will have to address, having coalesced around a common program, distinguishing it from the right, is to develop and unite behind a common program, articulating, to borrow from Marx, as I said, the struggle to achieve the immediate interests of the working class. And the working class is broader than wage labor. All right. The struggle to achieve the immediate interests of the working class, enforce their momentary interests, and push forward for socialism. A political economy, social formation in which the exploitation of one person or class by another, or the domination of one country by another, will be abolished or eliminated. We are still oppressed from Britain, where, of course, there are left comrades there. I don't know why they can't overthrow the system from home. Okay, so by and large, the Freedom Charter, particularly its clauses or economic transformation and land distribution, thematically features frequently and prominently as the basis of such a common program in many calls made by a number of left formations. It must be taken seriously while we open space for innovation, creativity, and dynamism. It is not my intention to address, and I have inserted this point in these current notes because I was going to address a different topic. I didn't complain about that because, I enjoy some of this. It is not my intention to address, related to the points that I've just made about the importance of unity of purpose, the question of organization, strategy, and tactics of the left, except to highlight it at this moment. I hope the question will be addressed in detail during the session on responses to neoliberalism, right-wing populism, and the role of the left, which will be chaired by mentor there, Comrade Dinga. However, I would like to highlight two works by Lenin, Left-Wing Childishness and Petty Bourgeoisie Mentality, and Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Referring to the left in Germany in 1920, Lenin said, "It is obvious that the left in Germany, the left in inverted commas in Germany, have mistaken their desire, their politico-ideological attitude for objective reality. That is a most dangerous mistake for revolutionaries to make. This tendency," he further said, "easily calls to revolutionary extremes, but it is incapable of perseverance, organization, discipline, and steadfastness. Linked with this, it will be dangerous to propagate politics suggesting that everything is possible at a stroke." And associated with this tendency is people simply saying, these things are possible. The problem is that there is lack of political will. Of course, that could be a problem, but we must pay attention to objective conditions. It is important to appreciate that the necessity to forge the broadest possible left unity arises from and is a response to the objective conditions of the struggle. You are talking about the struggle. You are not talking about the implementation of a change in a vacuum, in a laboratory, just where there is no resistance. There are forces that are in charge. And as Antonio Gramsci said in The State and Civil Society, that capitalism is in crisis doesn't mean that the capitalist class that controls the system has lost its strategic advantages and you can just come in and take over at the stroke of a lightning. It is important to appreciate the necessity to forge the broadest link, the broadest possible political front, as I've said, comes from and is a response to the objective conditions of the struggle, rather than a subjective exercise. Related to all of this, it is important to analyze the structural constraints of legislative and government power. A comrade earlier on here quoted Fidel Castro. What happened in Cuba? They went power nationally, but the enemy was very powerful externally and held up the revolution. In South Africa, we achieved a democratic transition in 1994. The enemy retained control of the economy of South Africa. And the enemy was not just some internal white people in this country. It was the imperialist system. And in fact, as Garnet has just said, imperialism in South Africa deepened further post-1994. And its economic stake is more stronger than it was in 1969, when the ANC analyzed it in the Morogoro Strategy and Tactics, pointing to West Germany, Japan, the United States, Britain, and France owning a stake in this economy. That if we were to tackle the apartheid regime militarily, the enemy was going to pass over from passive support to active military intervention. You see, this thing of analyzing these issues without an analysis of the balance of forces and what they mean on the ideas that we generate could lead to what Lenin here referred to as left-wing childishness. I have 5 minutes. Thank you very much. I have about 3 paragraphs. I will be done. Thank you. We will need to pay attention, like in South Africa, if you are to make a law, if you are to pass, you have got to consult. There is a judiciary, there is a legal system. And when I talked about capitalism, I'm not just talking about such an abstract system. I'm talking about even the legal doctrine governing this country. I'm talking about the constraints that gave rise to that legal doctrine. And when I'm talking about the structural constraints of power, I'm talking about the limits, the things you are able to do and you are not able to do in this power. So I'm saying, when you are pushing, it is important that you prepare our people sufficiently so that they will be able to withstand a backlash. The Cubans were able to withstand a backlash from 1960 up until now for over half a century. But the many things that are happening in South Africa suggest that some of our people will not, tolerate the absence of any electricity just for 3 days. So it is important to mobilize, to deepen mobilization, to prepare our people psychologically, mentally, to appreciate that some of the revolutionary things we are calling for are going to lead to a bitter backlash and could result in serious setbacks. People must be prepared to withstand, to organize, to push forward around those. That is very important. To this extent, there are some, I must say, one of the weaknesses, major weaknesses facing the left, and which is what I changed my strategy to read here. One of the major weaknesses facing the left is inner fighting, is internal fighting. You convene left platforms. When you arrive at the left platform, SACP this, ANC this, ZAPO this, COSATU this, SAFTU this, NUMSA this. No one talks about the party of monopoly capital here, the DA. In fact, there are some left, so-called left, who spend much of their time and energy criticizing other left organizations, seeking alternatives. They do not even give us a perspective and analysis of capitalism, its NGOs, its so-called civil society organizations, and its trenches and capacities and capabilities. It will be a sad day if we live here without analyzing the right. The SACP, the reason why I'm not going to respond to the many things that have been said about the SACP here is that as the vanguard party, it must be able to absorb criticism. And I do listen, I do hear you, comrades, but I'm criticizing you. I want a perspective. You see, when we deal with the balance of forces and you are discussing the right, I want us to say this is the right wing. Just as Tony Blair was the right wing in the Labour Party and deepened neoliberalism. And at that time, we could not say Labour Party this or support it. The reason why we support it is because of the changes internally that occurred in the Labour Party, giving us the more progressive Jeremy Corbyn. Are we saying the same is impossible about the ANC? I will argue not. But the future will tell us. And again, I do accept that we must go broader as the SACP has decided to go broader. But in going broader, you are not going to be able to go broader, Comrade Garnet. I think my Comrade Dinga, who I consider to be one of my mentors, I have a high regard for him, and I've just postponed my flight because I want to listen to him. One of the things he said to me last night was talking about polite politics. I can tell you, if you were to come to, you were in the SACP, you were with me, yourself, in the Young Communist League, by the way. If you are to enter the Central Committee of the Communist Party, with your input structured in that manner, I'm telling you the outcome is not going to be what you want. Because you are going to push the party and say, defend yourself. And I can tell you, if there is one thing we can do, that is that, to defend the party. All right. So,
1 minute, sorry.
So, the left must avoid the erroneous mistakes that we have pointed out from Lenin. In this regard, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Mzala Nxumalo Centre for the Study of South African Society for organizing this platform. I am appealing to the center, please, let this be not yet another event. It is rare in South Africa to bring different strands of the left together to reflect on the context and the way forward. Let this become long-term and deep going, and emerge at the end of the day in line with the views of Mzala as a vehicle for the left to forge a common, even if it is a minimum program to move forward. There are several policy considerations that have been put forward. I agree with Comrade Garnett. The issue of our mineral resources is very serious. We have moved it under the control of the state, but the state is controlling these mineral resources in the interest of the mining houses that export these mineral resources as raw materials to create jobs in Britain, in the US, and elsewhere. We must see these mineral resources as a strategic advantage to localize the production of finished products locally. And linked with this are the issues of expanding education, particularly through a decisive advance of the rollout, progressive rollout of free education for children from working class and poor households who cannot afford to pay university fees. I'm a strong proponent that the children of billionaires must pay.
Yes, they must.
I'm a strong proponent for that. And thank you, I was detained on the 29th of October, on the 29th of April, going to attend the launch of your Communist Party in Zimbabwe. And when you introduce yourself, you know, the flashbacks of that detention and one-day interrogation came back, you know. And this is also very important because it talks to what you mean by the left in Africa, not just in South Africa. Because we can arrive at the gathering and that party that is in charge there defines itself as the left. We must develop national production. Comrades, in conclusion, comrades, we must fight or we must do whatever we could to develop national production. Without production, there can be no human society. We are not animals. This is what distinguishes us from other categories of animals, if ever we are. The problems of unemployment, inequality, and poverty are not going to be resolved. And in conclusion to you, my comrade, I'm in the alliance. I know a capitalist coming to us telling us to fight the so-called white monopoly capital because this person wants to build black monopoly capital. To us, the problem is monopoly capital. If the problem is the bourgeoisie, the problem is the bourgeoisie. It doesn't matter whether they are pink or yellow or black. Okay, bye-bye.
That's a good place to end. A good place to end. Now, Derek is going to be very cross with me because we're seriously over time, but shall we take a few countries? You tell me what to do. Yeah. Why don't we have 10 minutes of questions and we carry on. Obviously, the whole discussion will carry on into the session after lunch. Okay, John over here.
I just want to respond to what Garnett said in the beginning of his talk, you know. The position that international capitalism is in meltdown, well, I can't say if it's true or not at the moment, but I must warn against that idea, because capitalism has proved to be incredibly resilient over the years. Marx was predicting the imminent downfall of capitalism. People did it with the First World War, with the Russian Revolution, with the Great Depression in the 30s. Every time, capitalism's about to end. With World War II and the growth of socialism in Eastern Europe, social democracy in Western Europe, and the Chinese Revolution at that time. The decolonization movement, the military defeat of the United States by a small country, Vietnam, the emergence of neoliberalism in the 2008 economic crisis. But every time, capitalism has adjusted. It's come out of it. It's very resilient. Now, I'm saying this not to say that capitalism is good, but just to warn us that this kind of determinism, it can disarm the left. It can make us think that the collapse of capitalism is inevitable, and therefore we don't have to do a lot about it. And so, I mean, what we do need to do is to look at the weaknesses of capitalism and say, okay, these are the weaknesses. How do we tackle it on the basis of those weaknesses and have our own program in response? Thanks.
Why capitalism, whenever it faces a crisis, is able to reinvent itself? The second question is, why socialism is unable, whenever capitalism faces a crisis, why socialism is unable to take advantage of this crisis? So I'm not expecting any answer to this particular question. I think that the gentleman has already talked to that particular question, This is what we need to apply our mind to. And until such time we find an answer to this particular question, socialism will never emerge. Now, another question is my question is the weakening of the left forces an admission that it ran out of ideas to envision a new society? I'm sure it is Garnet who talked about this issue of the weakening of the left. My question is that an admission that the left has run out of ideas to envision a new society? Because I submit that a moment the left forces become weakened, become unable to envision a new society, then it won't be in a position to provide leadership to the society. Now, I just want to make a comment on the issue of the objective reality. I think it's very important that we should not make a mistake, to view political will not as part of the objective reality. There are two elements that constitute objective reality. Actually, three. The subjective factors, which constitute part of the political will, and objective factors, which are structural in nature, and leadership. Now, you see, this, in my view, constitute what I consider as the objective reality. Because you can't have a situation where we are sitting with a political leadership which is capable, you see, of becoming the vanguard, you see, and to lead society out of a particular crisis into a particular direction. So leadership is an objective, is a subjective factor which manifests itself in concretely as an objective reality. So is the political will. The fact that we are sitting in this particular crisis.
Comrade, you can have to wind up. Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you for your discipline. Okay. Comrade with this check shirt.
I just want to make a comment, but surely maybe we'll get it to Bab Garnet Laputo Zoitolanjan. I've been listening patiently. But my problem is on the view that the leftists, I think we're in a crisis. On which basis? That we as young people, or the new generation, we find it hard to find a clear socialist that we can say we can look up to. For the politics and what we've been seeing around, you find that for one to understand the ideas of Marx, Engels, socialist society struggles, it has become a status. For one, if you understand such ideas, it gives you a certain status. But I feel that there is a lack of clear comrade, of committed individuals to these ideas. And what does that say to those who are still coming? I'm very worried there. Because judging on what is happening, you find clear comrade speaking socialist language today, speaking that capitalism must be crushed, but to follow a comrade to find that somehow is blending around capitalism views and practice. But theoretically, a comrade is a socialist and clear one. So it's a worry to us who are still coming and who are very ready and prepared to take on and move forward. On the issue of, I forgot the name, from SACP. In fact, I was coming to the question of the issue of white monopoly and what is happening, because the reality of the matter is that there is a coming wave of black nationalism, and it is true that it has captured the ideas of many of my generation. Hence, you find, while we are saying white monopoly must fall, it seems like we've forgotten, it seems like some people are pushing it in a verge of saying it must be replaced by black elite monopoly. And maybe what can be the view, or what are your views regarding such? Because I think it's an issue we are forgetting as much as we say white monopoly must fall. And yet, from 22 years since democracy we have achieved it, we've just seen a few number of black people making it. For instance, the NYDA, in my community, I've never met a person who was assisted by it. Few individuals. We are creating another class that is black, but that is owning. And yet they are becoming the capitalist, and on the view that they are black, I'm very worried. So maybe just your view on the issue of white monopoly and with the Guptas in the plate, because you find these issues, and it's very difficult to rely on the media in these moments, because you watch what AN7 said, you watch ENCA, but today I'm very hopeful that it will be clarified. Thank you very much.
You see, my comrade, I know sometimes prescribing classics could be boring. I will prescribe chapter 4 of Capital, volume 1 of Karl Marx to you. For you, just to look at the definition of capital and the formula of capital and the decisive statements that Marx make when he talks about capital in its appearance in the form of money. And those who personify capitals, calling them capitalists. And I think there is a confusion between those. The confusion between capital and capitalists. Okay? Some people would like to tell us that capitalists are capital. Okay? Hence the notions of white monopoly capital and so on. Okay? So don't be surprised when that doesn't come from the SACP. You must be happy because we study. We appreciate this thing. We look at it. There is capital and there are capitalists. Capitalists are those who personify capital. And in the epistemology of the word evolved to an extent where capital is made synonymous with capitalists, such as in the same way as labor is made synonymous with workers. Workers deposit their labor into this commodity. It is this labor that is being exchanged by the capitalists to accumulate from profit. Capital, and you want to tell me that is white? Comrade, I'm responding to those. And the problem, comrades, about this idea of white monopoly capital, we must get into it, define what we mean by capital, and reconcile that with black, white, female, Hindu, or Jewish capital. Okay, reconcile those things, because there is a problem. During the era of crisis, people tend to become inward.
Okay. Some people are pushing for ownership of capital. Some black people are pushing for ownership of capital. And they are making use of this notion to mobilize the working class on the basis of the color of their skin, simply because they are black. Therefore, it will be better to have the Johannesburg Stock Exchange owned by black but black capitalists. Let me give you an example. And I'm sorry not to respond to the rest. President Jacob Zuma, in his State of the Nation address, says, as the starting point of radical economic transformation, we are going to enact regulations requiring big companies that take tenders with the state to cede 30% of their contracts to black contractors. I say, what? From a labor perspective, there is a problem. This is radical. And I think about my conditions as a worker who has been out-contracted to a black company owner. And I'm asking myself, if I had the phone number of the president, I will tell him, in conclusion, that being radical would have been to give that 30% to the collective ownership of the workers who produce the wealth accumulated by those capitalists. And then to progressively increase it from 30%, 40, 50, until we reach to socialism. That is what will be radical, comrade. Yeah, not black capital. No, comrades. Just a brief comment on white monopoly capital. I think the concept has legitimacy, but the concept has limitations. That's the point that I was making. I think it's also wrong to say it doesn't exist in the literature of the party because we'll give you documents. It's there, you know. White monopoly in the wording. I was reviewing SSCP's literature on radical economic transformation. Their major intervention of 2015 has that wording, white monopoly capital. But that's not my main thing. My main thing is on Karl Marx and crisis of capitalism. I think Karl Marx actually was proven right by the real history, how it evolved. Because he basically says capitalism suffers from an aggregate demand, you know. It's a system predicated on capital accumulation, and yet that accumulation depends on people buying those products, you know. But people can buy so much and no further. So demand is limited, but supply is not limited in capitalism because it is predicated on that. So that's why it plunges into crisis. And it did plunge into a crisis of a disequilibrium that was very big in the 30s, the crunch. I mean, and even the solutions that were proposed were not market solutions. The World War literally saved capitalism. There's no market that saved capitalism. So in as much as we should caution that, and I didn't say, okay, let me say this. We must also not eternalize the resilience of capitalism. Capitalism is essentially a historical system that is very young, 1800, you know, 220-something years. It's not a very old system. Or how did I count correctly? You know, it's not a very old system. 16th century mercantile, but industrial capitalism, the one were, you know, later, 1800, you know. So it's, and for most of the time it has been in crisis, and its crises have not been the same. So what I was attempting to do was to chronicle the crisis of capitalism, was not to provide a theory that, no, because it's bad, it's going, no. I was saying there is no runaway industry. Even mainstream economics are saying it's a stagnation. Their brains are locked. No, comrade, I didn't say the left has run out of ideas. I'm saying the left is weak. That's the starting point we should move from.
it should be strengthened, you know. And in strengthening the left, we should try to bring about unity in diversity. In strengthening the left, we should try to build strong mass organizations so that the initiative by the people finds expression in our socialist logic. Isn't it that as socialists, we're the most democratic, you know, tendency in society, you know? So let's build democracy as we push for social progress. That should be our concept of linking democracy with social progress. That's why our South African democracy has not been that good, because it has not resulted in a lot of social progress for black people. Yes, monopoly capital restructured, but the neoliberal policies we implemented helped that restructuring. It did not happen in vacuum. Capitalism can't happen without a state. And it's about time that the state imposes its power over capital. Thank you.
Thank you, comrades. So now we have lunch to reflect.